Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks also for introducing the project. Just to sort of bring it back, this is from a SSHRC-funded study on the use of video evidence in criminal trials for police officers in on-duty shooting incidents. So you've seen some of Mike's analyses of one of the cases we're looking at, and Anne-Marie will probably end up presenting another example of one of our cases. And I'm going to look at two elements of two cases that we're examining. So you'll have seen about half of our collection by the time we're done today. So I want to take a look at how video technology has been used in two courts. One of these is in Canada and one's in the United States to address the issue of victim intent, which is often an important feature in trials for police officers. So one of the features of video evidence in criminal trials for the police is that video takes on a circumstantial character rather than a direct character. The actus reus is not in dispute in any of our cases. The officers fully concede that they shot the individual at the time and place that it occurred, and so as such, the facts of the case are kind of established. Instead, what's going on in the case is whether or not the officer acted, quote, reasonably, and Jay, Anne-Marie, and Carmen are going to detail some of the efforts that have been used to overlay a scientific reasoning onto this issue of reasonableness. I'm going to look at a tangential bit of sciencey type evidence, a theory from criminology, victimology, and something apparently called suicidology that I didn't even realize existed. But it's suicide-bycop is the theory, and if this theory were applicable to a case, then the shooting would be justified on the grounds that the subject to the shooting, the victim, would have left the officer no other choice, and therefore their reason to shoot would have been reasonable. Now, this sort of feeds into a literature on this issue of reasonableness that's quite broad in the legal studies scholarship. We like Max Gluckman's paper on the reasonable man in Barotse law, but this has led, for example, Arthur S. Diamond, not to be confused with the Arthur Diamond whose name is on the Columbia University Law Library, but Arthur S. Diamond states that the word reasonable, which has become so common in English legal parlance during the last century, ought to be never used again. And I have to agree that I think our team would agree that we are pretty much in alignment with that sentiment. So a shortcut to perceiving reasonableness in police use of force incidents is whether or not the police officer was put into a position where there was no other alternative but to use violence in defense of themselves or in defense of a third person. Such an assessment is to be made in reflection of things like the individual accused officer's training, their mental state at the time of the incident, how experienced they were both on the job and with use of force specifically, and the impression or perception that the individual they are interacting with had upon them. So in legal terms, the question that is asked of an officer is, would another reasonable officer in the same conditions make a similar or the same decision? In every case in our collection, the accused officer was confronting an individual, a subject, who was either self-evidently armed, for example, they were brandishing a knife, a person who they believed to be armed, that they were responding to a call for service for an armed person, or a person who was operating a vehicle in such a manner that the accused officer argued would constitute possession of a weapon. So they were driving the car to cause harm. Now, of course, it's not illegal to be holding a knife, nor is it strictly a cause for imminent risk of death or serious injury to drive a car haphazardly. So part of the task in court is demonstrating for the jury that the armed subject has the intent to use the weapon or vehicle to do those harms. As such, there tends to be fairly significant effort from defense counsel to characterize the victim of the incident as motivated by either doing harm or bringing harm upon themselves. And there's a certain amount of novelty to these defenses that's worth investigating, especially due to the fact that the victims are, in all but one of our cases, incapable of speaking about their motives themselves since they were killed in the incident. So that being the case, it's a matter of interest to us how victim intent is argued in court and such that the officer's actions might be understood as reasonable for the jury. So in the first of the two cases that I want to consider today is an incident from Toronto, Forcillo 2016. Forcillo was a Toronto Police Services officer who shot and killed an 18-year-old man named Sammy Yatim on July 23rd, 2013. On the night that he was killed, Yatim was riding the westbound Dundas streetcar in the city's west end near Trinity Bellwoods Park. Yatim was sat near the back of the streetcar across the aisle from the McGregors, a family of four who were returning home from a Justin Bieber concert. Yatim had been riding the streetcar for about 11 minutes when he withdrew a 12 centimeter or 4-inch switchblade knife from his backpack. He exposed his genitals and he slashed the knife towards the youngest McGregor daughter's face. He brushed her hair back with this, but he didn't cause her any physical injury. Yatim then yelled at passengers and followed them toward the front of the streetcar. The driver was unaware of what was leading passengers to rush forward, so he stopped the streetcar and allowed the passengers to flee. Through this time, Yatim had ample opportunity to slash or stab at passengers, but he didn't do so. In fact, he ended up speaking with the streetcar's driver for a few minutes afterwards as the passengers were calling 911 and police were responding. And during this conversation, Yatim asked the streetcar driver if he could borrow a phone, stating that he wanted to contact his father because, quote, "there's something going on and I don't know what the fuck it is." After asking for the phone, he told the driver that he could leave the streetcar and that he wasn't going to, quote, hold him for ransom. But the driver returned to the operator's station and continued to speak with Yatim. As police approached, the driver did flee, and Yatim remained on the streetcar. He was making some incoherent statements about someone, quote, knowing everything, until police approached and ordered Yatim to drop the knife. They shouted back and forth between each other for about 50 seconds, about 6 officers at the time of shooting. And then 50 seconds after arriving, the first officer on scene, Constable James Forcillo, shot and killed Yatim after he made a few steps towards the streetcar's door. Now, following a month-long investigation by the Ontario Special Investigations Unit, Forcillo was charged with second-degree murder. And following preliminary hearings, the Crown prosecution added a second charge for attempted murder. Forcillo was acquitted on the second-degree murder charge, but he was convicted on the attempted murder charge, which I've written about elsewhere, so I'm going to leave aside for today. Instead, today I'd like to focus on the novel social science and psychological theory of suicide by cop and how video evidence and other materials Yatim left behind were used to opine SBC as a scenario in this case. In the defense's argument, Yatim contrived the scene on the streetcar to provoke a police response and brandished the knife to force the police to shoot, making it necessary and therefore reasonable for Forcillo to do so. In support of this argument, they sought to introduce criminologist and former police officer Rick Perrant of Simon Fraser University near Vancouver as an expert witness. Perrant was among the first academics to write about suicide by cop. He did so in his master's dissertation or his master's thesis, which was submitted in 1996, and then again in his doctoral research of 2004. So suicide by cop was introduced into the popular lexicon in the 1980s by journalists who were seeking to explain a curious behavior of individuals who approached and threatened police officers with either fake or unloaded guns. And in many cases, those individuals would have either left suicide notes or asked the police to shoot them at the scene. In 1998, the first academic reference to suicide by cop was published by Hudson et al. Hudson was an emergency room physician, or is an emergency room physician, I'm not sure which. He was also writing with a number of police officers. And they found that their suicide by cop is indeed a real phenomenon and constitutes approximately 10% of all police shootings by LAPD officers between 1987 and 1997. The data they used to establish this was police reports from LAPD. The term that has since migrated into this term has since migrated into the victimological and criminological literature with significant publications, including edited collections and monographs. But through this, there's no consensus on what actually constitutes a suicide by cop. Hudson's criteria are probably indicative of a fairly strong consensus, although it's roughly an 85% consensus according to Perrant. That there must be some form of evidence of suicidal intent, for example, a suicide note or a conversation with a loved one. They must have an expressed, the victim must have an expressed and specific intent to be shot by the officer. There must be evidence of some sort of weapon that would aggravate the scene, and the victim must intentionally escalate the interaction with the police officer. So in Perrant's master's and doctoral research, he distinguished suicide by cop from other forms of victim precipitation, such as mental illness and psychosis, or, quote, irrationality. For a victim-precipitated homicide to be categorized as a result of mental illness, Perrant suggested that a formal diagnosis needed to precede the shooting. In other words, that the victim had been somehow seen by and attended to a professional in the psychological field. An irrational victim would be somebody who was, for example, fleeing from a scene and made a sudden and startling movement toward police that would lead police to conclude that they were holding a gun, for example, pulling out either a wallet or a radio to provoke shooting. And then in Perrant's research, suicide by cop involves a degree of planning and contrivance by the victim that they have to, in effect, contrive a scene that would result in a police response. Although unlike Hudson, Perrant does not believe that a note or a specific statement of intent was necessarily required. So on the 12th of July, 2015, Perrant was subject to a voir dire during the pretrial hearings for the Forcillo trial. And this was to consider his admissibility of himself as an expert and also the theory of suicide by cop specifically. During his direct examination, Perrant supported the theory of suicide by cop by referring to a number of, quote, stressors that he believed indicated Yatim's suicidal intent. These stressors were recovered from text messages Yatim had sent to his friends, where Yatim had indicated that he was broke, that he and his father had a difficult relationship and that they were estranged, that he was being kicked out of his father's home, and that he was struggling to find other places to live, that Yatim's mother had discovered his drug use and was displeased with her son, that he was dissatisfied with the direction of his life, and that he was comparing his life to his friends who were either attending college or who were working. Perrant also found that someone had used Yatim's phone to do a Google search for, quote, easiest way to kill yourself, and followed a link to a blog post, how to commit suicide without feeling any pain. And Perrant presumed that this search was performed by Yatim without solid evidence for making that conclusion, or at least that was found to be the case in court. And perhaps most crucially, Perrant described the scene captured on the surveillance video on the TTC streetcar, indicating suicide by cop, given that Yatim had these ample opportunities to slash or stab passengers or the driver, but he did not do so. So Perrant opined that when Yatim asked the streetcar's driver to borrow his phone to call his father, Yatim was intent on calling his father to let him know that he was the cause of Yatim's death and that he was going to be killed by a police officer. Again, this was not supported by evidence. Perrant's conclusion was that this was all an effort to create a preposterous scenario that Yatim knew would necessitate a police response and facilitate his death at the hands of police, producing a scenario where Forcillo would have been deemed reasonable. Now, Perrant was aggressively cross-examined by prosecution counsel Ian Bulmer, who took issue with nearly every element of Perrant's voir dire testimony. Bulmer started by noting that Perrant did not adequately represent Yatim's state of mind during the incident because Perrant did not comment on Yatim's drug use, nor did Perrant adequately investigate Yatim's toxicology report to rule out other causes for the incident besides suicide by cop. According to toxicology reports, Yatim had consumed nearly fatal quantities of MDMA, and the prosecution believed he was experiencing a bad drug trip. Perrant had asked for the toxicology report, but did not follow up with it when it wasn't provided, although he did operate on the assumption that Yatim had consumed something. Bulmer argued that this should have qualified Yatim for the psychosis category of Perrant's typologies of victim precipitation and not the suicide by cop category, and this led Perrant to concede that his opinion would have to be changed from unequivocal support of suicide by cop to a more than likely support. Bulmer also noted that Perrant was using the language of couched in psychological analyses, that he was analyzing these, quote, stressors, and that the activity Perrant had engaged in was described in the literature as a post-mortem psychological autopsy or a posthumous psychoanalysis. Perrant stated, both in direct and cross-examination, that he had no training in psychology and could not speak to a victim's state of mind, and was remarkably evasive in answering questions about what his report actually could conclude as a result. And this led Bulmer to angrily address Perrant at several points during his cross-examination. Perrant tried to insist that Yatim's texts, Google searches, and actions conformed with the conditions of suicide by cop, but Bulmer argued, and Perrant conceded, that he had no expertise in assessing psychological stressors or how they might induce suicidal behavior. The Crown further argued that whatever was going through Yatim's mind, Yatim was not on trial, and Forcillo had no access to Yatim's text messages or Google searches, and that he had no idea Yatim was trying to call his father, and therefore these could not have informed Forcillo's decision to shoot. Forcillo did testify that his training led him to conclude upon observing Yatim that he was either in mental health crisis or was under the influence of mind-altering substances, and the Crown argued that these conditions were plainly visible in the security video, and the jury did not require an expert analysis of them to explain Yatim's conduct. The trial judge, Justice Edward Then, agreed with the Crown on nearly all its arguments. Justice Then found that Perrant was not a credible witness, since he changed his opinion of the incident under cross-examination. He also found suicide by cop to not be a sufficiently established theory in social or psychological science, and that Yatim had not met the requisite conditions of suicide by cop because there was limited, if any, evidence of intent, for example, a suicide note. However, and most crucially, in Justice Then's own words, he found that Yatim's conduct was adequately represented by the uninterrupted recording of the streetcar video, and the jury would be able to determine Yatim's mental state without the assistance of an expert witness. Now, I want to follow along Max Gluckman's call for a comparative jurisprudence, and to do so, I'd like to compare the inadmissibility of Perron's testimony with another example of victim mindset evidence that was admitted in Texas versus Hess 2020. On January 18th, 2017, Officer Christopher Hess of the Dallas PD was responding to a call for service from a citizen who complained about a suspicious vehicle in a parking lot behind an apartment building. Upon investigation, officers found the car to be stolen and decided to enact a, quote, modified felony stop, or to approach the vehicle calling for backup, resulting in 6 officers arriving on scene, each of whom approached the car with guns drawn. Officers discovered the car to be occupied by 2 people, 21-year-old Genevive Dawes and her boyfriend, Virgilio Rosales, both of whom were asleep in the car. Dawes and Rosales were unresponsive to the shouts of officers, so Hess pulled one of his fellow officers' patrol cars behind the stolen vehicle to prevent an escape and used the siren and horn to rouse the occupants. Dawes awoke and attempted to flee by starting the car, backing it into the patrol car, then attempting to drive forward through the fence, and when that was unsuccessful, backed up slowly, no faster than 3 miles per hour in reverse, according to video analysts, until Hess fired into the car, shooting and killing Dawes. After the shooting, the car came to a stop against a building structure, and officers removed Rosales, who had only experienced minor injuries, and placed him under arrest at the scene. Officers then proceeded with a vehicle search, first discovering a pistol holster, then several minutes later discovering a loaded handgun. The prosecution sought to exclude the evidence of the handgun on similar grounds to which the prosecution in Forcillo sought to exclude the suicide-by-cop theory, that the handgun, like Yatim's text messages, were immaterial to Hess's decisions to shoot, and that the prejudicial effect of introducing the evidence would outweigh its probative value. Countering this, Hess's defense counsel argued that through his professional judgment as a police officer, he had perceived the vehicle and its occupants to be especially threatening and intent on doing harm, and that the presence of the weapon lent verification to Hess's professional judgment. Judge Brandon Birmingham sided with the defense, allowing Hess's counsel to show the body cam video of Officer Aaron Evans, who removed and secured the handgun from the car, and the defense used this to argue that this should instruct the jury to see Hess's decision to shoot as being more reasonable. Now, I'll leave aside for the moment discussions of the types of evidence presented here, that the handgun in Hess was physical evidence, whereas the suicide-by-cop theory in Forcillo was opinion evidence. Instead, I want to examine how video furnishes an assessment of an officer's action as reasonable in situations where it's impossible to interrogate the victim about their intent. In police trials, we need to weigh out the probative value of evidence in weight of its prejudicial effect, and this is problematized by the apparent lack of agency exhibited by police officers. Police officers do not attend these scenes of their own volition, but rather are ordered to attend and have a legal obligation to respond to the scenario according to professional and organizational routines and training. The question at trial then revolves around whether the officer's actions would be reflective of those routines and training. For example, would their training experience give them unique capabilities to assess a subject's actions that would extend beyond the knowledge of members of the public and jurors? Holding in abeyance the findings of justice then, that suicide by cop is effectively a junk science and that Perron was not a credible witness, the question would be whether or not a more credible science would inform both the jury of Yatim's intent and Forcillo's capability to perceive or interpret that intent from Yatim's recorded conduct. If we followed the jurisprudence of Judge Birmingham, it would seem this would seem likely, since knowledge not privy to the officer at the time of the shooting could be admitted to validate the officer's capabilities that are not necessarily common knowledge to the general public. So I set out today to examine how courts deal with the problem of something like a sixth sense that police officers attest to achieving from experience on the job, that they can identify problems in ways perhaps unfamiliar to the general public and therefore avail expert witnesses to opine on the support of the officers testified to experience. This would be roughly equivalent to Egon Bittner's discussion of appropriate use of force as a central element of the police officer's task, and Manning's discussion of the police métier, a form of habitus for police and the way they go about their tasks with an insider's knowledge and perspective. In Forcillo, we see a very naturalistic orientation to video evidence as pertains to Yatim's motive and intent. Yatim's intent is argued to be self-evident through the video, and presumably, even if a suicide by cop were solidified normal science and Perron a credible witness, this would be immaterial since Forcillo did not testify that he believed Yatim to be intent on committing suicide, only that he was in mental health or drug-induced distress. In Hess, we see a more interpretive handling of video, where context beyond the decision to shoot is added in following the video until the gun is discovered, affording the defense argument that Hess attested to his professional judgment about risk of the car's occupants was well-founded. And this, of course, begs the counterfactual question: if there was no gun found, would Hess still have been perceived as acting reasonably? Regardless of the answer to that one, what this shows us is some of the complexity and the divergent means of handling the complexity video evidence of police brings into court. Since victim precipitation is such an important element of settling the reasonableness of police conduct, and victims are unable to speak for themselves, how can courts go about recovering victim intent? By conducting a comparative sociology or anthropology of law and jurisprudence, we can reveal some of the problems video poses for trials of accused police officers, and how technology does something like facilitate a recovery of victim intent. The objective isn't to say these two cases are the same, but rather to examine how, in either case, information indisputably spurious to the decision to shoot is either accepted or rejected based on its capabilities to recover something of a victim's intent.